The silence in the small Virginia beach room seemed to hold the weight of decades of guarded secrets. It was January 1945, just 3 days before Edgar Cayce's passing, when a recording was made under extraordinary circumstances. For over 70 years, this tape remained hidden in the most secure archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, protected by Cayce's explicit orders and subsequently kept confidential by his family. Today, finally, his words can echo once more, revealing the deepest mysteries surrounding communication between the visible and invisible worlds. That frigid winter afternoon, Edgar Cayce was no longer the vigorous man who had dedicated over 4 decades to psychic readings and trance mediumship. His graying hair mirrored the wisdom accumulated throughout more than 14,000 psychic consultations, and his blue eyes, once piercing and full of energy, now held a serene melancholy, the look of someone who had glimpsed what lies beyond the veil of death. He knew his days were numbered, and there was something urgent he needed to share with humanity, something he had never dared reveal during his public sessions. The voice emerging from the antique recorder, after decades of silence, had an ethereal quality, as if it no longer entirely belonged to this world. Cayce spoke with the authority of someone who had walked the boundaries between dimensions, witnessing secrets few mortals are privileged to know. His words, imbued with profound spirituality and a transcendental understanding of existence, began to unravel the most closely guarded mysteries of how those who have passed continue to communicate with us. Throughout his life, Edgar Cayce had been known as the sleeping prophet, capable of accessing impossible information through altered states of consciousness. Renowned doctors had witnessed his extraordinary abilities, presidents had consulted his visions, and thousands of people had found healing through his psychic diagnoses. But there was something he had kept absolutely secret: his direct experiences with those who had already crossed the threshold of death. On the recording, his paused, contemplative breathing preceded each revelation. He spoke of how, since childhood, he had perceived presences others couldn't see, whispering voices from parallel dimensions, and subtle signs connecting the world of the living to the spirit realm. These weren't hallucinations or projections of a troubled mind, but genuine encounters with consciousnesses that had transcended physical form, remaining active and communicative on higher planes of existence. The first major revelation came when Cayce described the exact moment a soul leaves the physical body. Contrary to popular beliefs about an instantaneous departure, he explained how consciousness remains connected to the earthly plane for a period that can vary from hours to years, depending on emotional ties, unfulfilled responsibilities, and the person's level of spiritual evolution. During this transitional period, which he called the corridor between worlds, souls retain an intensified ability to communicate with those left behind. It was in this intermediate state that the clearest and most meaningful messages could be received. Cayce revealed how he had learned to recognize the signs, subtle changes in room temperature, inexplicable aromas appearing out of nowhere, vivid dreams that seemed more real than waking life, and especially that unmistakable feeling of loving presence completely enveloping the receptive person. He spoke of how his own mother, deceased years earlier, had communicated with him through a series of signs culminating in a transcendental experience that forever changed his understanding of the continuity of life. The technique Cayce developed for receiving these messages didn't rely on elaborate rituals or complex esoteric practices. Surprisingly, it was a matter of purity of intention and openness of heart. He explained how genuine love acts as a bridge between dimensions, creating communication channels that transcend the limitations of the physical world. Longing, when transformed into gratitude and not desperate attachment, became a beacon guiding souls on their journey of temporary return to the earthly plane. During his deepest experiences, Cayce described entering meditative states where his consciousness expanded beyond the confines of his physical body. In these moments, he could perceive the multiple layers of reality simultaneously: the material world with its limitations and densities, and the spiritual planes with their infinite possibilities of expression. It was in this expansion of consciousness that the most extraordinary communications occurred, not through audible words, but through direct transmissions of thought and emotion. The method he had developed always began with a period of inner purification. It was necessary to empty the mind of daily worries, fears, and expectations, creating a sacred space of receptivity. Prayer wasn't seen as supplication, but as vibrational elevation, an adjustment of personal frequency to attune with higher dimensions. Cayce spoke of how he had learned to distinguish between the voices of his own mind and genuine communications from spirits, developing a spiritual discernment that became his greatest tool. The messages, when they came, rarely followed conventional communication patterns. Some arrived through symbols that repeatedly manifested in the person's life, numbers, objects, situations that created a particular language between the communicator and the receiver. Other times, messages came through third parties, people who unknowingly became unconscious instruments of transmission, speaking words carrying meanings far beyond their conscious intent. Cayce also revealed how dreams constituted one of the purest channels of spiritual communication. During sleep, when mental defenses are relaxed and consciousness freely floats between planes, disincarnate souls find it easier to make contact. He described how he had learned to prepare for these dream encounters, creating a receptive state before falling asleep, formulating specific questions, and keeping paper and pen beside his bed to immediately record the messages received. But there was something even deeper that Cayce shared in this secret recording. He spoke of encounters that completely transcended the boundaries of ordinary communication, experiences where the separation between the communicator and the receiver temporarily dissolved, allowing a merging of consciousnesses that resulted in instantaneous and transformative understandings. In these moments of spiritual union, there was no need for words or symbols. Knowledge flowed directly from one soul to another, carrying with it not only information, but also the unconditional love that characterizes the true nature of existence. During these extraordinary encounters, Cayce had understood that death does not interrupt relationships, but purifies and elevates them to a higher level of expression. True bonds of love transcend the limitations of time and space, creating eternal connections that manifest across multiple incarnations and dimensions. The people who truly loved us continue to love us after the transition, and this love becomes even more potent by being free from the limitations and conditioning of the physical form. At this point in the recording, Cayce's voice took on an almost musical quality, as if the words themselves were imbued with a transformative energy. He began to describe his most significant experience, an encounter that had occurred just a few weeks before the recording, when he already knew his own departure was near. During a deep meditation, he had been visited by a luminous presence he initially couldn't identify. Gradually, through successive waves of recognition and love, he understood that it was his own spiritual guide, a being who had accompanied him since time immemorial, and who had come to prepare him for the final transition. This presence had revealed to Cayce the deepest mysteries about the continuity of consciousness after physical death. There was no harsh judgment or divine punishment awaiting souls, but rather a natural process of review and understanding, where each lived experience was reassessed in the light of universal love. Souls did not lose their individuality, but expanded their perception to include much broader perspectives on the purpose of existence and the paths of spiritual evolution. The process of communication between worlds functioned like a cosmic dance, where discarnate souls could temporarily approach the physical plane during special moments, birthdays, significant dates, periods of crisis, or intense joy for loved ones left behind. These moments created natural openings in the veils, separating dimensions, facilitating the flow of energy and information between worlds. Cayce explained how he had learned to create these openings intentionally, through specific practices that involved not only personal preparation, but also the creation of an environment conducive to spiritual manifestations. Lit candles were not mere romantic symbols, but instruments that helped raise the vibration of the space. Fresh flowers, especially those that had been significant to the deceased person, created aromatic bridges of memory and recognition. Music that evoked happy memories served as subtle calls, inviting beloved presences to draw near. but the most important element of all was the emotional quality of the receiver. Despair and anguish created energetic turbulence that hampered communications, while loving serenity and spiritual trust created magnetic fields that naturally attracted the presences of loved ones. Cayce emphasized how he had learned to transform his own grief of separation into gratitude for the moments shared, thus creating a state of receptivity that allowed for the clearest and most comforting communications. The stories that began to emerge from his experiences were extraordinary. Cayce spoke of how he had helped dozens of people over the years establish communication with their deceased loved ones, not through dramatic seance sessions, but through the development of their own natural spiritual sensitivity. Every person possessed this innate capacity, but most had lost touch with it due to the distractions and excessive materializations of modern life. He described specific cases where the communications had brought emotional healing and profound spiritual understanding. A mother who had lost her young child began receiving comforting signs through butterflies that appeared at significant moments, carrying messages that the child was safe and happy in other dimensions. A man grieving the loss of his wife began to feel her loving presence during lonely nights, receiving spiritual guidance that helped him rebuild his life with renewed purpose. The communications were not merely emotional consolations, but often contained practical information and specific guidance. Cayce recounted how he had received precise instructions on financial matters from a deceased person, revelations about important hidden documents, and even warnings about imminent dangers that saved lives. Discarnate souls maintained an active interest in the well-being of those they had left on the earthly plane, continuing to offer protection and guidance whenever possible. For those who wish to understand these mysteries more deeply and develop their own capacity for spiritual communication, it is essential to remain connected with teachings that transcend common knowledge. There are ancient wisdoms and contemporary revelations that can guide this journey of spiritual awakening, and remaining receptive to this information can completely transform our understanding of the nature of life and death. Subscribing to channels that share this sacred knowledge is like maintaining an always updated spiritual library, where each new revelation may be the key that unlocks doors to unique transcendental experiences. Cayce went on to reveal specific techniques he had developed over decades of experience. The first involved what he called heart tuning, a process where the person learned to connect with the specific emotional frequency of the deceased loved one. Each soul possesses a unique energetic signature, a particular combination of love, wisdom, and experiences that distinguishes it from all others. Learning to recognize and tune into this frequency was fundamental to establishing authentic communications. The process began with sacred memory exercises, where the person revisited moments of deep connection with their loved one, not moments of suffering or goodbye, but those instants of pure joy, mutual understanding, and unconditional love. These memories served as vibrational bridges, creating energetic channels through which communication could flow. Cayce explained how he had taught people to access these memories, not just intellectually, but to relive them emotionally, feeling again the loving presence of the deceased. The second technique involved developing sensitivity to subtle signs. Most people expected dramatic and obvious communications, thus missing the delicate messages constantly being sent. Cayce described how he had learned to pay attention to seemingly insignificant details, a song playing at the exact moment he thought of the deceased, a bird repeatedly appearing at his window, a familiar scent arising inexplicably. These signs, when observed with loving attention, revealed unique and personal communication patterns. The practice of active gratitude constituted another fundamental element of Cayce's method. Instead of focusing on loss and longing, he had learned to daily celebrate the gifts he had received through his relationship with the deceased. This shift in perspective created a positive, energetic field that naturally attracted spiritual presences, making communications more frequent and clear. Gratitude acted as a spiritual magnet, awakening in discarnate souls the desire to share even more of their love and wisdom. But there were times when communications transcended conventional methods entirely, arising through mystical experiences that defied all rational understanding. Cayce described how, during his deepest trance states, he had been transported to dimensions where he could directly encounter souls that had made the transition. In these higher planes of existence, there was no separation between past, present, and future. Everything existed simultaneously in an eternity of love and understanding. During one of these transcendental encounters, Cayce had understood that the very notion of death was an illusion created by the limitations of human perception. What we call death was simply a change in state of consciousness, like a person removing heavy clothes upon entering a home. The essence remains unchanged, only free from previous limitations. Souls didn't go away after death, but expanded their capacity to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, maintaining loving connections with all the planes where they had deposited their love. This revolutionary understanding explained why spiritual communications were not only possible, but natural and constant. Evolved souls were always sending love, protection, and guidance to those remaining on the physical plane, and the only barrier to receiving these messages was our own mental and emotional resistance. When we open ourselves with trust and love, the communication channels flow naturally, like rivers finding their way to the sea. Cayce's revelations also included information about the different types of spiritual communication that could occur. Some souls remained close to the earthly plane for specific periods, usually to complete emotional tasks or offer guidance during important transitions. Others ascended quickly to higher dimensions, but retained the ability to temporarily return when their presence was genuinely needed. And there were those special souls who assumed the role of permanent spiritual guides, accompanying and protecting their loved ones throughout their earthly journey. The process of spiritual evolution continued after death, but in a more accelerated and conscious way. Souls had access to cosmic understandings that allowed them to perceive the larger patterns of existence, the hidden purposes behind the challenges experienced, and the growth opportunities each experience offered. This expanded wisdom was frequently shared through communications, offering transformative perspectives to those remaining on the physical plane. Cayce spoke of how he had received profound teachings through these communications, revelations about the multidimensional nature of reality, the interconnectedness of all life forms, and the mysteries of reincarnation and conscious evolution. This information didn't come as intellectual concepts, but as direct experiences of knowing, where understanding was instantaneous and transformative. It was as if discarnate souls could directly transmit their spiritual realizations, momentarily elevating the receiver's consciousness to higher levels of perception. The communications also revealed fascinating aspects about existence in the spiritual planes. Contrary to popular images of heaven and hell, Cayce described multifaceted realities, where souls continued learning, growing, and serving according to their levels of spiritual evolution. There were dimensions of indescribable beauty, where evolved souls developed infinite creative capacities, creating worlds of light and harmony that served as cosmic schools for other developing consciousnesses. The work continued after death, but it was work of love and voluntary service. Many souls chose to act as healing angels, offering energetic healing to those suffering on the physical plane. Others dedicated themselves to spiritual guidance, becoming invisible mentors who inspired artists, scientists, healing practitioners, and spiritual teachers. Some assumed protective roles, especially guarding children and people in vulnerable situations. Communications also allowed understanding how our actions and thoughts on the physical plane affected those who had passed. Thoughts of love and gratitude created waves of positive energy that reached discarnate souls, offering them joy and energy for their own evolutionary processes. Sincere prayers acted as energetic gifts, strengthening the bonds between worlds and facilitating the spiritual work that souls developed in their new dimensions of existence. On the other hand, persistence in desperate attachments, excessive guilt, or anger over the departure created energetic disturbances that hindered the spiritual progress of souls. Cayce emphasized how he had learned to transform his own feelings of loss into celebrations of continuity, understanding that true love meant allowing souls to evolve freely on their spiritual journeys, maintaining loving connections without creating emotional entrapment. The most intense moment of the recording arrived when Cayce described his most recent experience, an encounter that had occurred just days before, as he clearly felt the nearness of his own transition. During a particularly deep meditation, he had been visited by a multitude of luminous souls, all those he had helped throughout his life through his psychic readings and healing work. They had come to express gratitude and to reveal to him the eternal impacts of his compassionate work. In this transcendental experience, Cayce had understood that each act of sincere love creates eternal waves of healing and transformation that spread through all dimensions of existence. The people he had helped find physical healing had, in turn, used their restored lives to serve others, creating infinite chains of cosmic benefit. Those who had found spiritual peace through his guidance had become beacons of hope in their own communities, indefinitely multiplying the effects of his original work. But the deepest revelation had been the understanding that he himself would continue his work after the transition, only in a more expansive and powerful form. Free from the limitations of the physical body, he could act simultaneously in multiple dimensions, offering healing and guidance to a far greater number of souls in need. Death was not the end of his mission, but its true beginning, a graduation to higher levels of cosmic service. This vision had filled Cayce with a profound peace and a spiritual excitement that completely transcended any fear of death. He had understood that he was simply moving from one room to another in the infinite mansion of existence, carrying with him all the love, wisdom and experience accumulated during his earthly journey. True relationships would continue, learnings would persist, and new opportunities for growth and service would open in abundance. The recording ended with Cayce offering a final teaching on how to recognize when we are genuinely receiving communication from loved ones who have passed. His voice, already almost a whisper, carried all the authority of decades of transcendental experience. Authentic communications always bring peace, love, and positive guidance, never fear, condemnation, or negative predictions. They elevate our consciousness and inspire actions that benefit not only ourselves but also others in our lives. Authentic messages also demonstrate intimate knowledge of details that only the deceased person could know, shared memories, private jokes, specific information that would not be available through other sources. But more important than any external proof is the unmistakable feeling of loving recognition that occurs when a true communication is established. It's like recognizing a beloved family member after a long absence. There is no doubt, only joy and restored wholeness. Cayce's final words on the recording carried a prophetic quality, as if he were already speaking partly from beyond the veil. Death is only a door, and love is the key that always allows passage between worlds. Those who truly love us never leave us. They simply expand their capacity to love us from new dimensions of existence. Learning to receive their continued love is one of the greatest gifts we can give both to ourselves and to them, because when we keep our hearts open and minds receptive, we discover that separation is only an illusion, and that reunion is our eternal destiny. The silence that followed these final words was profound, laden with implications that transcended ordinary understanding. When the recording was finally discovered decades later, those who heard it reported feeling a presence during listening, as if Cayce himself were present to ensure that his final teaching would be properly understood and shared with those ready to receive such profound wisdom. This hidden testimony represents more than simply the personal revelations of a gifted individual. It is a window into eternal truths about the nature of consciousness, the continuity of life, and the permanent bonds of love that connect all souls through time and space. As Cayce demonstrated through his extraordinary life and final words, communication with those who have passed on is not a supernatural phenomenon, but a natural expression of love that refuses to be limited by physical boundaries. For those who feel called to explore these deeper mysteries of existence, remember that each soul possesses an inner capacity for spiritual communication. Development of this capacity requires patience, practice, and above all, purity of intention motivated by genuine love, rather than mere curiosity. When approached with reverence and an open heart, the mysteries of communication between worlds gradually reveal themselves, offering comfort, guidance, and profound understanding of our eternal nature. Edgar Cayce's legacy extends far beyond his documented psychic readings and healing work. Through this forbidden interview, hidden for so many years, we receive a glimpse into the ultimate mystery, the continuation of consciousness beyond physical death, and the everlasting bonds of love that transcend all barriers. His final teaching remains both a practical guide and spiritual inspiration for those who seek to maintain connection with loved ones who have journeyed beyond the veil, discovering that true communication is always possible when approached with wisdom, love, and faith in the eternal nature of the human soul.